Well, hello there and welcome back. You have found yourself to the Showing Up to Life podcast and YouTube channel. And you found me. My name is Art Burns, and I'm happy to be here to share some thoughts with you today on mostly on, well, everything that I talk about has to do with mindfulness and the other sort of skillfulness that's associated with mindfulness, such as the skills of kindness and compassion, the skills of forgiveness and self-compassion, and all kinds of good stuff. So you're in the right place. I promise you that. You're not going to be sorry to hear some of this content, because what we talk about here is we talk about how to live in a way that is, that is happy, in a way that is, free from stress to the extent that we're able to, or to build the skills so that we can reduce the stress in our moment by moment experience so that we can show up to every moment and every experience with all of our attention, with all of our being, with all of our selves. And so I hope that you're enjoying yourself here. And I hope if you're back again, well, welcome back. And if this is the first time you're watching my podcast or YouTube channel, listening to my podcast, or watching my YouTube channel, I welcome you. We have a wealth of archived material. This is episode number 668 or 667, I believe, and that was, I did like maybe about 100 episodes before I even started counting. So there's lots of stuff back there in the YouTube and podcast archive. So have yourself a listen, have yourself a look. But today, I want to talk about stress. Well, and a lot of what I talk about here has to do with stress, right? Because in my life, stress was something that nearly killed me. It was, I used to be 100 pounds heavier than I am now. Used to have raging high blood pressure. Used to be a pretty, what we might call a destitute alcoholic. Lots and lots of problems, and it all arose from stress. Right now, before I get into this, but today what we're going to talk about, let me not bury the lead here, but what we're going to talk about, stress and the victim mentality, or you might call it victimhood, if you will, right? But before I get into it, I want to just let you all know, just as a little teaser here, I've almost finished my first draft of an ebook about stress and how stress keeps us from being happy. And so the working title of the book is How to Reduce Stress, Change the Story so that you can choose happiness. Okay, so it's the working title. I don't know if that's going to be the final title, but I just want to let you know that that's coming up. If you're interested in receiving a copy, send me an email at art@artburnscoaching.com. I expect it to be ready to send out by the middle of next week, hopefully. So if you're interested, send me the email. I'll send you one of the very first digital copies, and it's totally free, completely free. Okay, and to support or in conjunction with this, I'm going to do a couple of webinars coming up, right? And I mean, do we still call them webinars anymore? I'm actually going to call them workshops because it's going to be a little bit more interactive than just me going blah 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 blah, buy my stuff, that kind of thing. So keep an eye out for that as well. And if you want to get on my email list, send me that email requesting the ebook, and I'll make sure to send you whatever updates come up and any updates available regarding any of these free workshops that I'm going to be doing that can maybe help you learn a little bit about how stress really does impact, not only your happiness. I mean, yes, that's definitely true, but it impacts everything, right? When we're experiencing chronic stress, it's there with everything we do. Okay, it impacts the way we eat. It impacts the way we, watch movies. It impacts the way we make love. It impacts the way we, intoxicate ourselves. It impacts the way we work. It impacts everything. Now, that brings us to victimhood, right? Or the victim mentality. So let's first talk about what the victim mentality is. Okay, so the victim mentality is basically it's a personality trait, is how it's described in sort of psychology. Which is to say that it's something that just like everything we talk about here, a personality trait is merely something that you've done over and over and over so many times that it just becomes your automatic way of behaving. Okay. So that means that we arrive at this, it doesn't start as a personality trait, right? Nobody's born with the victim mentality, right? It develops over time, right? And so it's again, it's a personality trait, and that personality trait is marked by essentially feeling that everything that's wrong with you is something that's happened to you, right? Rather than just the circumstances of the world, right? And that everything that's wrong with you is somebody else's fault. Right. And then in turn, what happens is, and this is where we're going to get into how stress is involved here. I mean, stress is involved in the very beginning, but eventually this victimhood, or this victim mentality makes us feel like, anything I try to do to change it's not going to work because it's not my fault. It's everybody else's fault. Right. And so therefore, why bother trying? Right. Now that is a very, very uncomfortable place to be. If we're saying to ourselves, there's no point in even trying to improve things, that's pretty much the last stop on the train, right? That's where we want to say, okay, things are really, we're not happy. We're chronically not happy at that point, right? And so the awareness that mindfulness brings, right, the stuff that I teach, right, the practices that I teach my students and clients, help us to recognize that, wait a minute, I have this voice in my head that's telling me that everything is everyone's fault and that it's hopeless and all that. And at that point, once we see or hear or sense that story as an actual thing, right? Not this background thing that just colors all of our experience, but as an actual, wait, those are the words my mind is telling me. That is the instant in which we are no longer wrapped up in it. We are no longer, pardon the pun, a victim to it, right? We are now have a sense of control, a sense of agency. We can never control what goes on out there, right? We can't control what other people do. We can't control even what happens to us, right? I mean, can't control if it's raining, can't control if I get stuck in traffic, can't control if my company's, mismanagement has required cutbacks, I can't control any of that. The only thing I can control is the way I'm perceiving it. And if you're watching the video or if you're listening to on the podcast, I'm doing like the little speaking, motion with my hand, because that's where it all comes from. It comes from that story that we're telling ourselves, that inner narrative that's always going on, whether it's something you hear or sense as specific words, or again, it's just this sort of background, white noise of our consciousness, basically, right? But when it's unattended to, right, when that voice is just sort of, in the background, just influencing us without our knowledge, well, that's when we wind up with places like victim mentality, or in depression or anxiety, or any number of sort of diagnosable, mental maladies, let's call them, right? So where does this victim mentality come from, right? Because we're not born with it. Now, some of us are taught it, right? Like if you're, and I would imagine that everyone who as an adult says that, oh man, yeah, I feel that, I'm part of the victim mentality here, right? I would venture to guess that most people who feel that way, grew up in a home where their caregivers or the people around them were that way as well. Right, because there's two ways that we become who we become. Right, there's actually three ways, I guess. Kind of. There's first the baseline, right, when we're born. Right, now every human being is not born, with the exact same circumstances, the exact same apparatus for processing the world. Right. For instance, if you are descendant from a family who had financial struggle or some kind of strife in their lives, well, then you were born with a certain level of, cortisol and adrenaline and a certain, sort of baseline ability to deal with those things, right? Whereas somebody who grew up in a home that was more secure and more sort of happy and supportive, they're going to have a different level of that stuff, right? So right from the beginning, you are a little bit of who you are, right? That makes you a unique product of the unique people who you descend from, right? So that's the first way we become who we become. The second way is by modeling and absorbing the behavior of our caregivers and people around us, trusted people around us. Think cousins, aunts, uncles, school teachers, soccer coaches, baseball coaches, on and on and on, right? Now, the way we see those people interacting with each other and the way those people interact with us, I mean, including the attachment that you had with your primary caregiver, of course, this is also going to shape us into who we ultimately become. And that period of time between, well, the period of time I'm talking about here is between about, say 1.5 years old till about 8 years old, right? Your brain is like, filled with mirror neurons, and you are just taking it all in, absorbing it, and becoming what you're seeing, what you're experiencing, right? And then the third way in which we become who we become is just through our own daily process of living, right? Every moment. And this happens, I mean, they say that we stop developing, at first when we're 8 years old, and then we go through another development phase in adolescence and puberty and everything. And then at about 25 years old, that's when we're done developing. That is hogwash. That just is not true. The truth is that we're constantly always developing throughout our entire lifespan. So that's why when we do practices like mindfulness practices, within about 8 weeks, we see that in brain scans, the neuroplastic changes in the neuronal pathways of our mind that are physical neuronal changes that literally make us someone we were not, right? Like it literally changes the structure of our brain. Now, again, sometimes when I used to say that, people would be like, "You're going to change my brain? What are you talking about?" and it's scary to think that. But then when you think about the fact that, well, we've been changing our brains our whole lives, every single experience we have shifts and changes our brain for better or for worse, right? Now, let's get back to victim mentality, right? Let's say you're born into a house that has this sort of, victim mentality going on. Maybe your grandparents had it. You're born with it to a certain degree, right? But then it's practiced and you see it practiced. Mom and dad are always talking about how everything's unfair and it's not his fault, it's not her fault, blah, 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 right? And then we then take that into the world, and then everything we see kind of gets plugged into that sort of, narrative. And then we confirm and we reconfirm and we reconfirm and we reconfirm. And that victim mentality feels more and more and more real. And that's when it feels like, yeah, it is who I am. Right? So now, but as I said earlier, I really want to talk about the role of stress in this victim mentality. Because here's the thing. Remember those 3 areas I said, right? So if you as an adult feel like you identify with this idea of victim mentality, right? I would be willing to bet that your grandparents had some sense, or your parents had some sense of this as well, right? Well, actually, let me say this differently. I will venture to guess that your grandparents and your parents all experienced unusually high levels of stress on a chronic level. Because one thing has to do with the other, kind of, right? It's like you can't have one without the other, right? Because it is the stress that creates the story of the victimhood. Then that story becomes the confirmation, because we're carrying that story out into the world with us. And, oh, yeah, you see, there's another example. It's not fair. You see, it's not fair over there. It's not fair over there. And so that's where we become, sorry, I just had to turn off this little space heater I have down here. It's early in the morning and it's getting a little warm now. But that's how this stuff becomes, more and more entrenched, to the point where, we never get to step back from it and say, wait a minute, is this even true? Is any of this even real? Can I question it? Can I challenge it? For most of us, the answer is no, you can't. Because, well, you're not able to because you can't see it. You can't see it because you're in it. You're in it because you continue to experience chronic stress, right? That's the thing. You've been practicing being stressed your whole life, just like I have, just like my parents did, just like their parents did. And this is really important. It's very, very helpful. I want to just pause here and say that it's very, very helpful. You don't need to necessarily know the details of your grandparents' lives, and you don't necessarily have to go to, ancestry.com and go through that whole big process or anything like that. But the more you can, even if it's just intuitively, right? Even if you just, sit there, close your eyes for a few minutes and just, what years were your parents or your grandparents alive? Right? Like, what was their lifespan roughly? Right? So I know that my grandmother used to tell me stories that were, from the 20s, right? When she was like a teenager. So I'm going to say she was born somewhere around 1910, right? And she lived through the First World War. She lived through the Great Depression. She lived through the Second World War. She lived through, the economic boom here in the United States. But she never believed any of that. Like, even though they were very secure, they had a life now that most people would be like, oh my gosh, I would love that life. But to them, it was never happy. It was never okay. It was never enough. They were always afraid that they were going to lose everything, that it was all going to be destitute. Well, look at what she lived through, I mean, how could she feel any other way about it? Right? But now it's important to recognize, though. Right? Now, here's the thing, that when, and I've said this here before, but this is something in the ebook as well. When your grandmother was pregnant with your mother, okay, at about 4 months of gestation, meaning 4 months into your grandmother's pregnancy with your mother as the embryo and fetus, every ovary that your mother will ever make was in her body at that point. Okay, that's biology. That's unambiguous knowledge about biology. But what that really means, and this is really, really important, is that especially as it comes to stress, right? The cortisol and the adrenaline and the norepinephrine that coursed through your grandmother's body as she was pregnant with your mother, maybe like it was with mine during World War II, after living through World War I, living through the Depression, and now World War II. I mean, it's been nothing but strife and hardship. So do you think she was experiencing high levels of cortisol and adrenaline? I think so too. And guess what? My mother was experiencing all of that stress hormones as well, because she was present as a single cell within my grandmother's womb. Now, this is unambiguously known, unequivocally known by research and science at this point. This is not some theoretical thing, right? And so then, of course, whatever my mother went through, I also experienced in the same way, right? So because there's usually a deep connection because of this process, right? Like if your grandparents were very stressed, most likely your parents are feeling very stressed as well, right? Or whatever line, for me, both of them kind of were, right? But I'm talking about my maternal line right now. There's evidence that the same transference of knowledge and fear happens in the sperm cells as well. There's a amazing study that was done. I think I've talked about this before with mice, where they had a male mouse. They exposed the male mouse during adolescence and adulthood to a certain smell, and whenever he smelled that smell, they zapped him with a little electricity. Right? So that's like Pavlovian. That's nothing, no big deal. They've been doing that for centuries. But here's the thing. They let that male mate, and then the son of that male, one of the sons they took out of the litter, never smelled that smell in his whole life and never experienced an electric shock in his whole life. And they let that mouse come to adulthood, let him mate. Then they took one of the grandson mouse, right? Now this is a whole generation removed. This mouse's father never experienced the electrical shock and never experienced the smell. And then one day, in the mouse's adolescence, they released the smell into his tank. And the instant he smelled that smell, he braced as though he was going to get the shock of his life. He had no basis of knowledge of what was going to happen. He did not cognitively know anything about any of this stuff. But there was an understanding deep in his cells from what his grandfather went through, right? So if your grandparents were hungry and had terrible money problems and stuff, guess what? You are going to experience money problems and money stress for your whole life. Again, it's part of the story that was created before you were even born. Now, this is very, very helpful stuff to understand because this tells us why. Why do I become stressed about this stuff? So now, anyway, getting back to our victim mentality, I know I'm wandering around here a little bit. I do that in this podcast. You all know that. When I say that victim mentality is caused by stress, right? I mean intergenerationally, as I'm explaining to you here, right? But even on a more individualized understanding, because remember that impact of your ancestry is just one way in which you are developed, right? The second way is, remember, your childhood experiences, basically, right? And so again, if you had grandparents who had a difficult time, then probably your parents were having similar struggles. And that struggle requires stress, right? The stress in the body is nothing more than the brain and nervous system trying to survive, even if the only thing they're trying to survive is a thought. Which now brings me back to what really is, well, not what is stress. That would take way too long. I only have a few minutes left in this episode here, so I cannot answer that question for you. But what I can tell you is that, well, as Hans Seeley, who was a very early pioneer in the work and the understanding of stress in the body, he said that almost all stress we experience is emotional stress. All stress we experience, or almost all stress we experience, is emotional stress, because stress is there, again, as a survival mechanism, right? But most of us in this world live in live a life that is not dangerous, right? Most, not all. There are people who live lives of danger, right? In certain, crime-ridden areas, war-torn regions, and that kind of stuff. Food shortages and stuff like that, right? So for some people, it is a truly day-to-day struggle to survive, right? And I think we shouldn't discount that is the experience for certain human beings, or for many human beings on this planet. And that deserves our compassion. And that deserves, if we can, some, energy and effort to try to reduce some of that suffering, right? But the important thing to recognize is that for most of us, and again, it's like, 77% of Americans, I had read a while ago, 77% of Americans reported that they felt chronic stress or experienced chronic stress like every day, and that they worried about how much it impacted their health. And that worry was correct. That worry was absolutely valid. Just saying. But the thing is that 77% of Americans are not living in a life of day-to-day, moment-by-moment danger, right? That's a fact. That's just not how it is for most of us. So most of us are in this chronic stress at our desk, right? In our car that has air conditioning and heat and heated seats and everything else. But we're experiencing this chronic stress because There's an emotional fear that goes on. There's a feeling that I can't manage the pressures that I'm experiencing, even though those pressures are not really dangerous, right? But that's where the story comes in, right? The story that things are supposed to be a certain way for me. I'm supposed to have a certain kind of house, a certain kind of car, a certain kind of family, a certain kind of health, a certain kind of, girls are supposed to look at me. I'm supposed to be handsome. I'm supposed to be rich. I'm supposed to be whatever it is, right? That story is a thought process, right? And what we know here, if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you've probably heard me say that our whole lifespan of experiences can be seen in three basic realms. The realm of the thoughts, which is the story, the realm of the emotions, and the realm of the physical body sensations. Okay, so let's go through how this process works. I'm sitting there at my desk saying, I don't have the kind of, my office isn't really beautiful. I don't have the kind of car I want. I don't have, my kids aren't the kind of, they're not, super geniuses and Olympians. And I'm, struggling in this job that I hate, and I don't have the money that I want, right? Now that story that's going on, and it could be happening. I mean, this could be happening while I'm typing an email, it's like a background sort of, narrative that's happening, not necessarily something we're actually listening to, right? That's getting back to my point from before, but before we get into that, when my brain experiences that story, or when my mind, let me say it this way, when my mind is telling that story, there's a part of my brain that's listening, okay? And that part of the brain, called the amygdala, is scanning everything that I ever experience. Every thought, every emotion, every physical sensation, as well as every experience of my outside world, right? And everything that comes in through my five senses, or my interoception of, memory and emotions and thoughts and physical sensations, the amygdala is scanning all of it. But here's the thing. The amygdala is like, I always think of it as like you're putting your most nervous and twitchy and panicky person in charge of watching the door at a party. Right? And everything feels like it's a disaster to this person, right? Every single person. No, you're trying to crash this party. You're bad. I got to get rid of you, right? Because the amygdala is there for one reason and it's not really just there for one reason, but the most important thing it does is it keeps you safe, right? That's what it's ultimately there for. That's what all of this is there for, is just to keep us safe and keep us alive, keep us from being saber-toothed tiger food, right? But this apparatus doesn't just, go away when there's no saber-toothed tigers, right? There's whatever danger. And so your amygdala hears that story you're telling yourself. And it hears you saying, oh my gosh, it's everybody else's fault. Yeah, you're right. It is everybody else's fault. We deserve better. It's not fair. It's always going to be this way. It's so terrible, right? Now what happens here, those three realms of experience, right? They are causative. They're not just correlated, right? They're not just so happens to be three ways that we experience our lives. No, the thoughts create and cause the emotions. The emotions create the sensations in the body, and the sensations in the body inform those thoughts. Okay? So if you're sitting in a beach chair in the Bahamas, sipping on a little pink drink with an umbrella in it, feeling like, everything is just so wonderful, well, then the story in your mind in that moment is going to be, this job is not so bad, your kids, they have plenty of potential, we have plenty of time, everything's going to be okay. And guess what? Your emotions then are emotions of happiness. And the physical sensations, because you're so relaxed, are allowing for this positive potential of your thoughts to happen. which is why the story, nothing different happened, right? There's no significant difference in our lives, whether we're on vacation or in the office, right? It's still just a moment in our lives. But at the desk, we're feeling the tension. And that tension in our body is what then causes that thought process to happen. And every time the amygdala hears that stuff, all it knows how to do is to scream over to the other part of your brain called the hypothalamus, which then the only thing that knows how to do is kick a signal over to the pituitary gland, which then very quickly signals the adrenal gland down by our kidneys. And now we've got cortisol and adrenaline and norepinephrine coursing through our bloods, creating a different mindset. This is how it works. So in very real ways, the victim mentality is not the cause of the stress, at least not just the cause of the stress. It is also the result of the stress. So therefore, we don't need to tell ourselves not to be a victim. We don't need to tell ourselves, oh, you're stupid, you're wrong, get over it, come on. What we need to do is we need to cultivate the skillfulness of non-judging awareness. And so that we can see when those thoughts pop up, we can say, okay, no. I'm not listening to any of this about my kids right now, because the story that I'm hearing right now has everything to do with the condition of my body right now and very little to do with any kind of objective reality in my world. So it's like blah, 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 blah. For you on the podcast, I'm sticking my my fingers in my ear like a little kid and going blah, blah, blah. I can't hear you. But that's kind of what it becomes. It becomes so in a playful way, in a way that we're so skilled at it that we can say, oh, come on. You kidding me with this story? Come on. That's not true. Come on, let's just try to relax our body a little bit and just like focus on the feeling of the breath and let it all go. Right? Now, of course, I make it sound very simple. It is very simple, but it requires work to get there, right? And that's what mindfulness is all about. It's all about practicing to develop a skillfulness so that we can meet those moments, because they're always going to be there. You did not create it. You have no way of avoiding it. Right? If that's what your grandparents were, that's what you are. There ain't no change in that. There's a way to process it differently. There's a way to manage that, but it's not like you can't just take it out, right? Like you can, it's like trying to take the egg out of a baked cake, right? You just can't do it. So all you can do now is work with it. And that is where the practices come in, because with the practices and with the skillfulness that the practices cultivate, you can manage it, and you can manage it deftly and expertly. And you can do so in such a way that allows you, despite all of the history, despite all of the epigenetic, reality of your body, you can choose to be happy. And in that happiness, and it's not that we're going to choose to always be happy, right? That doesn't exist either, right? But we can allow for the conditions of happiness so that we can return over and over and over anytime we find ourselves in that tension and that stress. All right? All right, so this is a lot of what we're going to be talking about in these workshops. So keep an eye out. Or again, if you want the ebook and you want information on this stuff, send me an email at art@artburnscoaching.com. Otherwise, please like, subscribe, share, tell your friends about this. If you like this podcast, tell people about it. Please, want to get the audience, my ego needs the audience. I'm just kidding. I don't really. It doesn't bother me whether there's 3 people who listen to this or 3,000 people who listen to this. But I'm here to help. So if there's somebody in your life who you think needs to hear this, please let them hear this, okay? All right, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I wish you well. I'll be back, who knows, maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after. We'll see. Have a great day, everybody. Take care.